All right, let me go ahead and begin. This is a course on science and the Bible, part of the theology program, which is a ministry of Reclaiming the Mind Ministries. We are in week number 4 of this particular series of classes on science and the Bible. And today we're going to be talking about the interpretation of Genesis 1 and discussing various approaches to that vexed question, at least in some people's minds. Let me just do a second mic check here, just double check that you guys are still hearing me all right. Terrific. All right, appreciate that very much. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into our material this evening. The plan, as usual, is that I will give something of a lecture for close to an hour, roughly, and then I will open it up for discussion. I can't imagine that we won't have some discussion because this is a very controversial topic, perhaps getting into the most controversial aspects of the subject matter, at least within the evangelical community, that we will be covering in this course. Genesis chapter 1, there are a variety of issues that we would like to talk about with regards to Genesis 1. An obvious issue that will come up is what to make of the 6 days of Genesis 1, or the 7 days, including the 7th day, which is in Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3. But there are other issues to be explored as well that pertain to the whole controversial subject area of science and the Bible, and so I will try to get to as much of that as possible. So let me begin by saying that Genesis 1 is only one of many passages that talk about creation in the Bible. There is a lot that is said about creation in the book of Job, in various Psalms, in the book of Proverbs, famously in chapters 3 and 8. Romans chapter 1 has something to say about it, and there are various other places as well. So if we're going to do justice to the entire Bible and its teaching on creation, we would need to spend time looking at all of those passages. And of course, we would need to look in depth at Genesis chapter 2 as well as Genesis chapter 1, and really go as far in Genesis, the early chapters, as we could. But we can only do so much in an hour, and so we will focus this particular class session on Genesis chapter 1. Now, as I said, the main issue that many people are interested in regards to Genesis chapter 1 has to do with the days and what the days mean. But before we get into that, we need, in terms of how the days correlate with modern science and whether they're 24-hour days and so forth, we really ought to get a perspective on the chapter as a whole, on the passage as a whole. Now, for the purposes of simplicity, I will be referring frequently, as I already have, to Genesis 1. However, to be precise, the passage that we are discussing runs from Genesis 1:1 through chapter 2, verse 3, or chapter 2, verse 4, depending on which scholars that you're looking at, because there are various ways of dividing up the passage. But generally speaking, chapter 1, verse 1 through the first 3 or 4 verses of chapter 2. And I'll be referring to that passage most of the time simply as Genesis 1. Now, the basic structure of this passage is very easy to understand, and we should take notice of the structure because it comes up over and over as we discuss the interpretation of the passage. The most obvious observation to make is that the passage is structured in terms of the 7 days. However, that's not the entire story with regards to the structure of the passage, because what you have actually is an introductory couple of verses, chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, And then you have the 7 days, beginning with verse 3. The verses 1 and 2 are not part of or are not included in the first day in the structure of the passage. The first day actually begins with the words, "Then God said," in chapter 1, verse 3. So actually there is an eightfold division to the passage. You have the introductory paragraph of chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, and then you have days 1 through 7, so that you actually have an eightfold structure to the passage. Now, that leads to a discussion of what we're looking at when we're looking at verses 1 and 2. Very famously, of course, being the first two verses of the Bible, in most translations, verses 1 and 2 say something like this: "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters." And then you have the beginning of the first day in verse 3, "Then God said, let there be light." Now, there's a few different ways of looking at the first couple of verses. And scholars have picked over this and argued this, and we're not going to settle it tonight, but I do want to introduce the issue to you and share with you my own perspective or opinion on this question. The translation that I just quoted to you is a fairly traditional rendering of the passage. It indicates in verse 1 that God did something, and this is an event, as it's commonly translated and understood, that precedes the 7 days. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So that verses 1 and 2 are understood as describing what God does prior to the 7 days. Again, that first day of the 7 begins in verse 3. But there are a lot of scholars today who don't agree with that, and they would understand verses 1 and 2 as a summary of the entire passage. In other words, they would understand the statement, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," to be a summary of everything that was going to take place in all of chapter 1. And therefore it's not referring to an initial event in creation, but is a summary of all that God did. Now, you might see where this is going, but you might not, so let me spell it out for you. There is a trend in biblical scholarship away from understanding Genesis 1:1 as referring to God creating the universe out of nothing. The classic Latin phrase here is ex nihilo, which is just Latin for out of nothing. The conventional Jewish and Christian doctrine of creation, and Muslim doctrine, by the way, as well, is that God created the universe using no pre-existing materials. That's what we mean when we say out of nothing. And so when God created the world, according to the traditional Christian understanding and Jewish and Muslim understanding, God created the universe by simply calling it into existence, by simply willing it to exist. He didn't have to find some stuff and organize it into a world. He just made it happen. And Genesis 1:1 is traditionally understood in that way. However, if Genesis 1:1 is not the first thing that God does in the passage, but is a summary of everything that God is reported to do in the passage beginning with verse 3, then you could see that this would not necessarily imply or indicate that God created the universe itself out of nothing, but rather that God, as it were, comes along, finds the universe in a mess, which is how this is usually interpreted in verse 2, and he organizes it, he cleans it up, he gives it form, he gives it structure, he gives it some kind of purpose and direction, and he brings living things into the world and populates it so that it's no longer formless and void. But that's all the passage is telling us. It isn't telling us that he actually brought the entire cosmos into existence out of nothing on this understanding of verses 1 and 2. Now, I don't agree with this revisionist interpretation. I think the traditional Christian and Jewish understanding of Genesis 1 is correct. There are a number of exegetical issues here that some of them are rather technical fine points in Hebrew that I doubt I could explain adequately in this setting so that people would really grasp it. But I do want to say a couple of things so that people understand some of the issues here. If verse 1 is understood as a summary statement, then the implication is that verse 2 describes a situation that was not God's doing. And this is crucial for many revisionist interpretations of Genesis 1. And so they're quite different ones. But the usual idea is that God finds the universe in a state of chaos, however that might have happened. And so he then introduces order and life into this chaotic cosmos. Now, there are two versions of this theory. One is a largely discredited exegesis of the passage known as the gap theory. The gap theory is the idea that, and this actually is consistent with understanding verse 1 as creation out of nothing. God creates the universe, and everything is peachy, everything is wonderful, and then something happens. The text doesn't describe the event that brought this about, but it describes the results in verse 2. The universe is a mess, it's chaos, and according to the gap theory, the universe was messed up between verse 1 and verse 2. We don't know how, or at least we're not told how in the text of Genesis itself. But reading between the lines, literally between the lines of verse 1 and verse 2, the gap theory argues that the devil and his cohorts rebelled against God between verse 1 and verse 2 and brought about a disastrous state of affairs. And verse 3 is the beginning of God's redemptive efforts to bring the universe back into a state of goodness, of everything being good again. Well, there are some serious problems with the gap theory, and I wouldn't bother talking about it, except that although it is largely discredited, there are some significant rumblings and efforts to bring it back. And one person who is probably doing more to revive the gap theory than anybody else, just about, is actually, he's a friend of mine. I strongly disagree with him on a number of theological issues, but that would be Greg Boyd. Greg Boyd, in his books, particularly his book on Satan and the problem of evil, and in other books as well, Greg argues for a version of the gap theory, in which the formless and void condition of verse 2 is the result of the devil's revolt against God. And so he portrays all of Earth's history from Genesis 1-2 onward as a spiritual battle, a spiritual war, and that human beings were created in the context of a spiritual war that had already begun and that was going on between God and his angels and the devil and his angels. And yes, this is the same Greg Boyd who advocates a theology known as open theology or open theism. Now, there are a number of problems with this gap theory and any version of it. The most obvious one, and the one that's simplest to explain, anybody can really grasp this, is at the very end of Genesis chapter 1, the text tells us that God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. That's Genesis 1, verse 31. Now, Greg Boyd knows this verse is in Genesis. He just doesn't see the implications of this verse the way that I would, and I think most Christians historically have seen it. And that is that at that particular juncture, there was no spiritual war going on for control of the cosmos. Everything was fine. Everything was good. And that seems to be the plain implication of Genesis 1:31. Well, the other variant on this idea that Genesis 1 verse 2 describes a chaos that God has to fix is not a gap theory, but it's a little bit more mysterious and hard to pin down, and it's something that, for example, Bruce Waltke appears to be advocating, and that is that the initial conditions there of the cosmos have nothing to do with what God had done, because Genesis 1 does not describe anything that God does until verse 3. And the reasoning here is that God would certainly not make the universe at any time formless and void. In other words, how can you say God created the universe and created it formless and void? In fact, doesn't Isaiah say that he wouldn't do that? And so many people will turn to Isaiah 45:18, and if you have a Bible, you might want to look at that with me. They will look at Isaiah 45:18 as proving that Genesis 1:2 cannot be describing the universe as God made it in its initial conditions. Isaiah 45:18, "For this is what the Lord says, God is the creator of the heavens. He formed the earth and made it. He established it. He did not create it to be empty, but formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is no other." That's Isaiah 45:18, reading from the Holman Christian Standard Bible. Now, Isaiah 45:18 is not saying that at no time in the history of the cosmos as God was working on it was the universe formless and void. But rather it's saying God doesn't stop there. God isn't finished with his creation until it is formed and populated with the creatures that God has designed to live in it. And specifically here in Isaiah 45:18, it's the earth. He formed the earth and made it. And likewise in Genesis 1 verse 2, it says the earth was formless and void. And so the argument is a misunderstanding of Isaiah 45:18, which is not saying that at this initial stage or early stage of creation that the universe, that the earth was not, could not have been in this condition if God was at work in it. But rather this is only a stage, an early stage in the process. God doesn't stop there. And so I really don't think that Genesis 1:2 should be read as saying that there was something wrong with the world that God had to fix, but rather the world wasn't finished yet because God was just getting started. He created the heavens and the earth, but at this stage, it's not yet, the earth is not yet fully formed. Things are not where they are supposed to be in his design, and it doesn't have the living things that he intends to put on it. That's all that Genesis 1:2 is saying. Now, if that's correct, and again, this would be by far the traditional historic Jewish and Christian understanding of Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2, then those two verses are describing the initial creation event of God bringing the universe into existence and the initial or early conditions prior to the 7 days that we read about beginning with verse 3. Now, one other point here, and that is some translations of verse 1 eliminate the idea of a creation ex nihilo by rendering the words in a different way than what you find in the King James Version or the New American Standard or the NIV. You can see this, for example, in the New Revised Standard Version, which is usually a very good version, very good English translation, but I think gets it wrong in some places, key for theology, and unfortunately this happens to be one of them. Genesis 1:1 in the New Revised Standard Version says, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void." In other words, the idea here is that God's creating the heavens and the earth is not referring to an initial bringing it into existence, but an initial action upon a chaotic state. And there's those are completely different understandings of God's relationship to the world. Excuse me. It is a radical departure from the historic Jewish and Christian understanding. Now, grammatically, you can get away with this if you're allowed to kind of tinker with how the Hebrew words are accented in this verse, because in your main Hebrew text, you'll just have the Hebrew consonants, and you have to kind of read between the letters, literally, to figure out exactly what the words are. So you could say in a linguistic or bare grammatical sense that this is a possible rendering. However, it's not the way the Jewish Masoretic scholars understood the Hebrew text, as we find in the Masoretic textual tradition. It's not the way the Greek Septuagint understood Genesis 1:1, which in the Greek quite clearly states, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," period. Next sentence. And it's not the way it was understood in the ancient Latin versions either. In other words, this is a very late exegetical option for Genesis 1:1. The earliest exegete you can find who understood the verse this way is about 1,000 years after Christ, and it doesn't really take off until the 20th century. And because it's just barely possible, but nothing in the text demands it, I think we should stick with the historic and clear textual versions that we have from the early centuries of Christianity and Judaism. Now, all this is very important because we evangelicals tend to get very excited and exercised over issues like the age of the earth, but in the cosmic scope of things, that's a small issue compared to the issue of creation ex nihilo, because it goes to the heart of the question of what is the distinction between the creator and the creation. Genesis and the rest of the Bible clearly teaches a sharp distinction between creator and creature, between creator and creation. All of existence is divided along that line. God is the creator. He makes the world by himself, Isaiah says, Isaiah 44:24. There is no other creator. There are no other helpers. God does not have a team of engineers and construction workers go out and make the universe for him. He makes the universe by himself, Isaiah 44:24. He brings the universe into being by an act of the will. He speaks the word, and it's there. Hebrews 11, verse 3. The whole basic fundamental concept of biblical worldview is that God creates the world out of nothing. He makes it without using any pre-existing materials. The world is not eternal. God alone is eternal in the sense of having no beginning. So this is a very important issue, and it's probably the most important issue is, do you believe in a creator to whom we are all totally accountable, absolutely accountable, because he is the maker of all things? Or do you compromise that in some way? Now, there are mediating positions between a belief in a creator and a rejection of a creator. Classic example would be Mormonism, which maintains that there is a God. He is credited as being the creator, but creation, the act of creation, is understood as organizing the world into its present form. Interesting how this seems to be a very popular idea in a variety of circles in the past couple of centuries. That eliminates the idea of an absolute distinction between the creator and the creation. In Mormonism, there is a sliding scale between God and creature. In fact, there really is no such thing as us being creatures as compared to the creator. We are, human beings are, really gods in embryo, potential deities ourselves. And the breakdown of the whole idea of creation out of nothing is basic to that misunderstanding. Now, I might mention in passing, we'll talk more about this later, in a later class, not today, but I might mention in passing that science has finally caught up with the traditional understanding of Genesis 1:1, because science now has been forced into the conclusion that the universe came into existence basically from nothing. Now, there are scientists who are holding out for the possibility that we might be able to speculate what was before what is commonly called the Big Bang, but frankly, it's all speculation. It looks like the universe began with a singularity in which there was, for all practical purposes, nothing, and then there was something. What is the cause of that? Well, there has to be some kind of a cause. There has to be some kind of an explanation. And the scientists who developed the evidence for this, very many of them were unhappy with it because they could see that it pointed in the direction of a creator. All right, now, I want to start talking now about the 6 days. We've talked about Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2. And now we're really in a position where we can talk about the 6 days. And there's a number of issues that need to be addressed here. But first, I want to look at what some of the options are. And if you have the syllabus notes, which if you enrolled in the course, if you formally enrolled in the course, you were able to get a packet of syllabus notes, of outlines and charts for this course. And if you didn't get that and you are enrolled in the course, be sure to ask for that because you have that coming to you. Well, in that packet of notes, there is a chart called Interpreting Genesis 1, which looks at 4 basic approaches and a dozen views. And I'm not even claiming that these are exhaustive, but this covers most of the popular views that are either have been around for the last couple hundred years or are still around. I just want to survey what these views are for us all together so we're on the same page as to what the options are and the issues are. One category of interpretations of Genesis 1 is what I'd call a partial creation approach. And we've talked already about some of these approaches, the gap theory being a good example. In a partial creation approach, the Genesis 1 is not, at least in its entirety, talking about the creation of everything, but only the creation of some things. And specifically, depending on which one you're looking at, the 6 days mark a special period of creative activity, not describing the creation of everything, even on the earth necessarily. So, for example, John Sailhamer, who was an evangelical biblical scholar, Old Testament scholar, Sailhamer argues that chapter 1, verse 2 and onward, from verse 2, is an account of God's creative acts in the land of Eden, in Eden, not on the earth as an entire globe. And this allows him to take the 6 days literally, but not come up with a young earth position, because the activity of God described in Genesis 1 from verse 2 on is understood by Sailhammer as all being localized to a very small part of the earth, which was the described in chapter 2 as Eden. Well, that's a view that is getting some traction now because Sailhammer is a fairly influential evangelical Old Testament professor and a published author and very knowledgeable and does good job of making his case, of presenting his views. Another view that I would describe as a partial creation approach that's worth noting is the intermittent days theory. The intermittent days theory is really fascinating. It takes the 6 days as 6 literal, chronologically successive 24-hour day periods. But it understands that there is a gap or a separation of time between the day, so that you have a literal 24-hour day, then you have a long period of time, then you've got another literal 24-hour day, day 2, then you got another long period of time until you get to day 3. So that the days are the days on which God initiates various creative ventures, starts bringing plants into the earth, or starts bringing fish into the oceans or whatever, but not describing the entire creative period in which God does those things. Robert C. Newman is an example of a scholar who holds to this intermittent day theory. And Newman, again, is a staunchly evangelical, conservative, Bible-believing scholar. And I emphasize this, that we could talk about almost all of these views as being advocated by evangelical Protestant Christians who affirm the inerrancy of the Bible and take a fairly conservative traditional view of the Bible's authority, yet they come up with very different interpretations. Well, the second major category of views with regards to Genesis 1 would be the young earth approach. And there are really, you might think, well, there's only one young earth approach, and that's the young earth creationist view, 6 literal 24-hour days. Well, more or less that's true, but we have to qualify it because there's really a second view. In addition to what we could call the plain day view, 6 plain 24-hour days, nothing complicated about it, in which all creation takes place. There is another view, which is also a young earth view, which we could call the relativity day view. And there are scientists and Christian interpreters and a famous, pretty well-known Jewish interpreter named Gerald Schroeder who have advocated different forms of this. They don't agree with one another, but what they do agree upon is this, that relativity theory allows you to have your young earth cake and eat it too. Because you can say that the earth is only several thousand years old from one perspective, but at least the universe in which it is found is, from another perspective, billions of years old. And Derek Humphreys is an example of a young earth creationist who takes this approach. He's I think he's a pretty well-known young earth creationist, and we talked about him, I think it was last week. And in another connection, with his belief that our solar system is at least near and our galaxy is near the center of the universe. Well, Humphreys needs to place the galaxy that we're in, the Milky Way galaxy in our solar system, near the center of the universe to make his relativity theory of the cosmos work. So that from one vantage point, the Earth is only a few thousand years old. From another, it's living in a universe that's, at least from one perspective, appears to be billions of years old. and that's Derek Humphreys. A third category of views on Genesis 1 would be the long day approach, or for our purposes, we can just talk about one that's a viable option today, and that's the day-age view. The day-age view has been advocated by such individuals as Gleason Archer, perhaps one of the 2 or 3 premier evangelical Old Testament scholars of the 20th century. I don't think too many people would want to take issue with that. Even those who disagree with him on this, I don't think would take issue with that. He wrote a famous, classic, standard textbook, A Survey of Old Testament Introduction, that's been used by, probably hundreds of thousands of Christian students studying the Old Testament. Archer advocates the day-age view, and in his books, including the Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties. And another very well-known advocate of the day-age view would be Hugh Ross, who is the founder and president of Reasons to Believe, which is a scientific apologetics ministry that is founded on an old earth creationist understanding of the science Bible issues. In the day-age view, each of the 6 days of Genesis 1, or the 7 days if you want to include the 7th day as well, each of the 7 days represents a long period of time, an age, a very lengthy period of time of millions or hundreds of millions of years. And these are consecutive long ages, perhaps overlapping, and one kind of blends into the next, as days tend to do anyway. But they're roughly, consecutive representations in Genesis of the order in which God actually did things, but over a lengthy period of time. Somebody who holds more or less to the same view would be John Collins. C. John Collins, for example, in his book Genesis 1 through 4, advocates something like the day-age view, although he isn't terribly interested in nailing that down, at least in that particular book. Then the fourth category is a kind of catch-all for what I call non-literal views. There are several different kinds of non-literal views, but they all agree that Genesis 1 should not be read literally. Now, this is a minefield. The whole discussion of what it means to take the Bible literally, what it means to take any passage of the Bible literally, it's a minefield of argument and contentiousness. But scholars from this perspective would not pull any punches. They would say they would be frank in saying we are not understanding Genesis 1 literally. Good example of this category of views would be the Revelation Days view. On this view, there is a kind of literal component to it, but the 6 days are 6 literal days during which God revealed to Moses how he had created the world. And if any of these so-called non-literal views comes close to being a literal, at least an attempt to read the passage literally, it would be this Revelation Day view, but there are certain aspects of the passage it just doesn't take literally. The framework hypothesis is probably the best known of these among evangelicals. Charles Hummel advocated this back in the 80s. Meredith Kline was perhaps the scholar who did the most to give this traction. Meredith Kline is a Reformed, very conservative, Calvinistic, Old Testament scholar, theologian, very creative thinker, likes to think outside the box, and he promoted the framework hypothesis or the framework view. Today, probably one of the scholars that's pushing this the most might be Bruce Waltke. I think he's in this category. And then finally, I should mention that there's another non-literal view, which is the one view out of all of these that we're talking about here that you will find non-evangelicals embracing as well as some evangelicals. And that is what is called the cosmogonic view. And I'll probably have to spell that. O-N-I-C, cosmogonic, which has basically the idea is that Genesis 1 is a cosmogony, and a cosmogony is a particular genre in which you talk about the origins of the world in order to teach something about God or the divine, the gods, if you're a polytheist. And the cosmogonic view then understands Genesis 1 as fitting into this ancient genre of stories of the origins of the world, which are designed to teach something about God, not trying to tell us exactly how God did it. Just to back up a bit, Waltke seems to embrace different aspects of different views, and so I'm not positive that he's an advocate of the framework view, because he does advocate something like the gap theory as well, but it's not the traditional gap theory, so it's a little bit confusing. So, like I said, this is an attempt to be exhaustive of a typology of all these different views. Well, this cosmogonic view, Karl Barth advocated it. Klaus Westermann, a well-known liberal mainline Protestant German Old Testament scholar, advocated it. But today you can find evangelicals like John Walton advocating this particular way of reading Genesis 1. And so on this view, the 6 days are part of a religious theological statement about creation. The form, the rules of the genre would be similar to what you'd find in pagan stories about origins, but this story is designed to teach us the truth about God, which is that He's one, that He's all-powerful, that He's ethical, that He's holy, etc., etc., rather than trying to tell us things about how the cosmos came into its present formation or anything of that nature. All right, so you've got a lot of different views there with regards to the interpretation of Genesis 1. Now, young earthers will be quick to say, and they're right, that the reason why there is this plethora of exegetical options for reading Genesis 1 is because so many of us are at least have one eye on the question of how one can understand Genesis 1 to cohere with the modern scientific positions being taken in mainstream science with regards to the age of the universe, the age of the earth, and other matters. And so, if you are convinced that the physical evidence proves that the universe is billions of years old and that the earth is billions of years old, if you're convinced of that, and you're also convinced of the authority and inspiration, truth of the Bible, including Genesis 1, you're going to look for some kind of way of harmonizing Genesis 1 with the scientific evidence. Is this a bad thing? No. But we need to be careful, obviously, not to let our desire to bring harmony between the passage and what we think modern science is saying, not to let it cause us to run roughshod over the text. So it could be, and old earth creationists and others who hold to an old earth would say, this is a good thing because we are now alerted to some facts we didn't know before that will cause us to go back and take a more careful look at what Genesis 1 is really trying to say, whereas young earth creationists are going to say, no, these people who are advocating these different interpretations of Genesis 1 are compromising the authority of Scripture, contradicting the clear teaching of Genesis 1 in their zeal to accommodate the Bible to modern science. So there's the argument, okay, in a nutshell, as to what's going on here with Genesis 1. Now, there are so many things that I'd like to say about this, but let me first talk about the question of what kind of a text this is. I mentioned the issue of the genre of the text. The cosmogonic view and similar views maintain that Genesis 1 was never meant to be read anything like a literal fashion, and that it is really something more like poetry in some cases is the way this has been described. Now, this isn't as straightforward and simple a matter to adjudicate or decide as you might think. There are points on both sides. On the one side, clearly Genesis 1 is a narrative. That is, we've got a series of verbs. Almost all the verbs would have to be construed in English as past tense verbs describing this happened, then that happened, and this other thing happened. So it's a narrative. It's a story, whether it's a true story or a fictitious story. It's at least some kind of a narrative, and the fact that the action is organized in this sequence of days, day 1, second day, third day, fourth day, etc. That also, clearly forces the reader to read this as some kind of a narrative. Now, what kind of a narrative is it? Well, it's in Genesis, and Genesis is part of the Pentateuch, and Genesis 1 leads you forward through the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph and the other sons of Jacob, into the book of Exodus and the rise of Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, into the Promised Land, where we, of course, know they did end up getting there, however they got there. And what's the point here? Well, the point here is that Genesis 1 is part of a narrative which historically has been understood. Historically, that is, it's been understood through most of Jewish and Christian civilization as an historical narrative of the origins of things, including, first of all, the origin of the world, the origin of the human race, and the present human condition of the human race being in sin and death, and what God does in his promises to the patriarchs to call a people to himself, the people of Israel, and form the nation of Israel in the Promised Land. And Jews and Christians both historically have understood that this is giving us not just a narrative, but a true narrative of what actually took place. Well, why wouldn't you say that about Genesis 1? Well, in which case it looks like we should read Genesis 1 as historical narrative. Because where in Genesis are you going to draw the line? Or are you going to draw the line between Genesis and Exodus? Or perhaps between Deuteronomy and Joshua? Or maybe between Judges and 1 Samuel. I mean, people draw that line in different places. I don't think you can do that. And most evangelicals don't think you can do that. So it looks like Genesis 1 is narrative, and it's historical narrative. But on the other hand, Genesis 1 is an unusual historical narrative. And again, if you have the syllabus notes, the outlines and charts that I provided for those of you who are in the course, I have a couple of pages there, which is the text of Genesis 1, color-coded to bring out the unusual form of this narrative with various repetitions that turn the passage into what looks like a series of stanzas. You have phrases like, "Then God said, let there be," which is repeated numerous times. You have various separations. He separated the light from the darkness. He separated the waters from the waters. You have the refrain at the end of each stanza, "And there was evening and there was morning." One day, second day, third day. You have the line, "And God saw that it was good," that gets repeated several times. And so if you read Genesis 1, and again, I tried to print this out on these 2 pages so you could visualize this, and if you don't have this, you can print it out yourself and color code it yourself, underline and circle and whatever, and you can see this, that it looks like Genesis 1 is a narrative, but it's a narrative presented in a series of stanzas or separate units that have a great deal of rhetorical qualities to them that you don't usually find in a straightforward historical narrative. But is it poetry? Well, it depends on, I guess, your definition of poetry, but it's not typical Hebrew poetry because it doesn't use the kind of Hebrew parallelism that you find in the wisdom literature. It doesn't have the same kind of literary form that you find in Proverbs or Psalms or Job, chapters 3 through 41 or 42:6, or Ecclesiastes. So it doesn't have that form of Hebrew parallelism, which is what we usually mean when we say Hebrew poetry. I like John Collins's solution to this issue, or answer to this issue of genre. He says it is an exalted narrative. It's an exalted prose narrative. In other words, it is a narrative, but it's using highly rhetorical, stylistically flourishing, very stylized kind of presentation of the material. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because if it isn't just a straightforward historical account in the usual kind of narrative form that we find, for example, in Kings or something, then perhaps our expectations as to what the text is doing might be a little bit different. And this would at least open us up to some of these alternative understandings of the 6 days or the 7 days than what we have if you simply assume the young earth reading. Now, this doesn't settle any of the issues. I'm just trying to introduce some of the aspects of the controversy. Let me now finally say something about the days, and I I haven't left much time to do this, but there's a lot of introduction that has to be done before you can even know what's going on. There's some oddities about the days, about the way the days are presented in the passage, that at least encourage us to look elsewhere than a straightforward 6 literal consecutive 24-hour day interpretation. There's some grammatical oddities. In the Old Testament, in Hebrew, when you have in a typical historical narrative an account of things happening on a series of days, the typical thing that you'd find in several times in the book of Numbers, Joshua, Judges, is on the first day, on the second day, on the third day, all the way up to whatever day it was, on the 7th day several times, on the 8th day, even on the 12th day. And the grammatical form here is a very routine form, and it translates into English in a very straightforward way, on the second day, on the third day, whatever. You don't have that in Genesis 1. Instead, you have this very strange kind of refrain that ends each stanza. And there was evening and there was morning, one day, in verse 5. It's not the ordinal number, first day. It's one day. Nobody really knows why. It's echad instead of rishon. Rishon would be first day, first, and instead it's echad, one day. And it doesn't say the first day, the second day, the third day. It says second day, third day, fourth day, which is very unusual. That's not how it's done in biblical Hebrew. So then there's this odd expression, and there was evening and there was morning. Now in the King James Version, this line is translated, and the evening and the morning were the first day, and the evening and the morning were the second day, etc. But that's really not a correct translation. In fact, one could say that it is, for all practical purposes, a mistranslation. That is not what the Hebrew says. What the Hebrew says is, and there was evening, and there was morning, one day. And there was evening, and there was morning, a second day, a third day. Which, by the way, this does open the door somewhat to Robert Newman's intermittent day theory, although I think it has problems in other ways. But the whole syntax and structure and grammatical forms here are unusual. They are kind of weird. And it looks like the reason why that's the case is because this isn't the usual straightforward sequence of days. That seems to be the implication. Now, there are several things going on here in Genesis 1, and many arguments back and forth on this issue of what are the 6 days or the 7 days. And in the study notes that I provided, I have a table of 20 young earth arguments and standard old earth creationist responses to those young earth arguments. I can't go through all those here, and I won't try to do that. I'm sure some people here will bring up some of those arguments. But I want to focus on a problem that I think faces anybody who takes the traditional young earth creationist reading of Genesis 1. In fact, I want to mention two problems that personally led me, if I could be autobiographical here, to question the young earth view. Because when I was in college, I advocated the young earth creationist view. I wrote papers in a secular university for my secular professors defending the young earth view. So I was gung-ho, and I was convinced, and I was writing these papers. But it wasn't the scientific evidence. I was already aware of most of that. It was a more careful reading of Genesis 1 that led me to question my young earth creationist understanding of the text. Now I just want to mention two things that have really made me rethink that. The first is that a lot of the language that's used in Genesis 1 is really not consistent with all of the action taking place in 144 hours, which is, 6 times 24 hours would be 144 hours for the creation period. For example, in Genesis 1:11, we read, "Then God said, let the earth produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and fruit trees on the earth, bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation." Now, the language there is very explicit. It does not say that the plants appeared full-grown, sitting there in the ground, but rather that the plants came forth from the earth. They emerged from the earth, grew up out of the ground, bearing seeds, etc., etc. Well, the language there is the language of natural processes. It's not describing God waving his hand and trees, instantly appearing in a barren, hitherto barren ground, but rather God saying, "Let the earth sprout forth vegetation." Now, I grant you that God could have sped up the process so that the plants grew really, really fast. But now what we're really doing is engaging in some ad hoc explanations to save the young earth view. And what I want to suggest to you is this. The simplistic view is the young earth creationists take Genesis 1 literally, and everybody else does not. That's the simplistic view. That's the party line if you're a young earth creationist. It was my understanding when I was in college. That turns out not to be accurate. The fact is that young earth creationists take some elements of the text literally in a straightforward way, and others not. That is, some things they don't take at face value. This language about the plant, the vegetation sprouting forth from the ground, they don't take that at face value. They have an ad hoc explanation for that. Now you could say, well, the old earth creationists have an ad hoc explanation for the days. Well, there you go. It's not a matter of one side taking everything literally and the other side not. It's a matter of different interpreters taking different parts of it literally and trying to figure out how to fit everything else into their particular scheme or their particular interpretive model. And so right there you have to say, oops, maybe it's not possible to take everything in Genesis 1 at face value, at its plain sense. And if that's the case, the door is open to saying that with regards to the days. Now, the other thing that I noticed, and I'm not the first person to notice this by any means, but something that I had to give careful attention to was this issue of when God made the heavenly bodies. Now, on a straightforward, standard young earth creationist interpretation of the passage, God made the sun, moon, and stars on the fourth day. That means for the first 3 24-hour periods, there was no sun, there was no moon, there were no stars, there was no solar system, there was no galaxy. There was simply a light source that is unspecified as to what it is. Let there be light. And so, as I looked at that, I asked myself, is the text really intending to teach that the sun, moon, and stars did not exist until the fourth day? Well, there is one aspect of the text that I think is really hard to square with that claim, and that is that Genesis 1, verses 3 to 5, which describes the light, talks about the light being separated from the darkness. Verse 4, God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and he called the darkness night. And there was evening, and there was morning, one day. Well, notice that there is a separation of the night from the day on day 1. So if we're going to take this as a 24-hour period, there is apparently an institution of the rotational period of the Earth being a roughly 24-hour period, I would assume, as it is today, give or take a little bit. And you have a rotation in which there is a light source that is illuminating the Earth so that you have that cycle of day and night. Now, in order for this light to do its job, it has to be tens of millions of miles away from the Earth. Otherwise, there isn't going to be any night. It's all going to be day. But if you bring a lamp up very close to your the back of your head, you will have light in your face, and you will not have any darkness. So this light source that is supposedly not the sun has to be a long distance from the Earth. Also, if it's a physical light, it has to be generating roughly the same amount of heat that our sun generates, because you notice that there are seas, there are oceans, there's water on the Earth, and it's not evaporating, and it's not frozen. And so you've got to have an environment with light and heat that can sustain a liquid ocean, and also can sustain plants, because plants are introduced on the third day, before the sun supposedly exists. Well, I had really difficulty with that, and not for scientific reasons, but simply trying to understand the coherence of the passage, because the description of the fourth day says, let there be lights this is verse 14, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. Now, just a second here. I thought the day from the night, day and night were already separated back in verse 4. But here in verse 14, we're told that the lights in the sky, the sun and moon, separate the day and night. Well, now that looks like maybe the sun and moon already existed. And of course, the ancients knew that the light source that created the opportunity to have alternating day and night cycle was the sun. So I'm not convinced that Genesis 1 even intends, or that Moses intended to teach, that the sun and the moon were physically introduced into the existence of the cosmos on the fourth day. I just don't think that's the right way to read the passage. Well, there's a lot of other things that we could talk about here, but I've gone over the time allotted for my lecture period, so I'm going to open it up for questions and comments. We're going to give priority especially to those of you who are enrolled in the course, but we'll certainly be open to entertaining comments or questions from others as well. So at this point, I'm going to get off the microphone, turn it over to our moderators, and you'll be given an opportunity to ask your questions in turn.
Paul, a student of the class, asked a question regarding what the immediate audience understood the meaning of the word days to be, as spoken of in the Genesis account of creation. Here's how Rob replied.
Well, I've already pointed to a couple of aspects of the text that I think point in a different direction, but admittedly, for centuries, for a couple millennia, virtually everybody reading Genesis 1 understood the 6 days not to refer to eons of time, although not everybody understood them literally. For example, Augustine thought that the 6 days were a symbolic way of describing what God did in an instant. He didn't believe that God did it in 144 hours. He thought it was a much shorter period of time. He had the opposite problem with Genesis that many of us do today, thinking that it's a longer period of time. He thought it would have been something God would have done in a snap, and it would not have taken him 144 hours. But most people have interpreted it, yes, to mean 6 24-hour periods. However, the fact that this is sort of the default reading that most people have had is not itself proof that this is what the text actually intends to teach. I would suggest, for example, that there are various passages, a lot more passages than the one in Genesis 1. There are a lot of passages that seem to the casual reader to imply that the earth is stationary and the heavenly bodies revolve around the earth. This was, in fact, the view that most people took until Copernicus and Galileo came along and showed otherwise. And they didn't just have one passage to argue about, they had several. Joshua 10 and Ecclesiastes 1 and Psalm 104, and there were several of them. So I would say that the fact that people have misunderstood certain passages in terms of cosmology type questions does not mean that we have to stick with that old misunderstanding. I think it's possible for people to get some of these things wrong and later information to help us correct our misunderstanding. Now again, the simple or plain interpretation isn't always right. For example, many people seem to think that the obvious meaning of Colossians 1:15, which calls Christ the firstborn of all creation, is that he's the first creature. Well, that may seem like the obvious meaning, but it's not the right meaning. And a careful attending to the context will show that that's not what Paul means. But it's easy to see how people could misunderstand it that way. So, yes, this is, we're bucking the way most people have read the passage. But, I think your question assumes that when people read the passage, God is obligated to make it understandable to them in every particular, and I don't think that's the case. I would say one other thing, and then I'll go on to another question here, and that is, if the purpose of the passage, and I think this is where the cosmogony view at least has part of it right, if the main purpose of the passage is to teach us about God and our relationship to God, and not to teach us about the history of the cosmos, the age of the earth, etc., then it's quite possible that the main point of the chapter has been getting through just fine, even if we were misunderstanding some of the particulars.
Paul asked another question regarding Adam and his appearing to have been created in a mature state, and how that corresponded to the rest of creation. Here's how Rob responded.
Well, I think we're probably going to get into this more next week, but I can go ahead and give you a brief answer now, and that is that this is the argument that has to do with what's called appearance of age. That when God created Adam, presumably he didn't create him in the developmental stage of an embryo or a one-day-old infant, but created him as presumably somebody who was full-grown, or at least close to fully grown, perhaps a teenager or young adult. And wouldn't it be then analogous to that to say that when God created the universe, he didn't create the universe looking 2 seconds old. He created it looking 10 billion years old, even though it was really only a few seconds old. Well, there's some real serious problems with this analogy. For example, there's the issue of starlight. When I look at the sun through a proper filter in the sky or out of the corner of my eye, I am not seeing the sun as it is now. I am seeing the sun as it was 8 minutes ago. When I look at the moon, I'm looking at it as it was a quarter second ago. That's not that big of a difference. But when I look at the nearest star other than the sun, I'm looking at it as it was 4 years ago. That's not the star that's there now. It's the star that was there 4 years ago. And this continues out so that if you look at stars that are thousands of light years away, you're looking at those stars as they were thousands of years ago. Well, our own galaxy, just our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, is 100,000 light years across. And we can see outside our galaxy to other things. So that would seem to indicate that these other stars and these other galaxies are much more than 100,000 light years away. And therefore that what we are seeing is those galaxies as they existed more than 100,000 years ago. Now, there are all kinds of interesting ad hoc, make it up as we go along, creative explanations to get around this evidence. Derek Humphreys, I mentioned, as an example. But if you're just looking at the evidence without trying to fit it into a particular theory, it looks like the universe is billions of years old. I'd also say this, in terms of the appearance of age argument. When God created Adam, I guess you could say if you looked at him, he would look like a typical 15-year-old or 20-year-old or whatever age you want to speculate Adam would have looked like. And Eve the same way. But I can tell you this, Adam would not have had 15 years of tooth decay in his teeth. He would not have had, he would not have had physical infirmities building up over time that looked like they had been building up over time. He would not have had wrinkles. Of course, if he was 15 years old, he wouldn't normally look like he had wrinkles, but he wouldn't have wrinkles. He wouldn't have various other physical signs of a process of degeneration or a process of aging. And that's what we really are looking at when we're looking at stars and when we look at the Earth and we look at the cosmos. We're looking at signs of aging, not just signs of age. Oh, it looks 10 years old, it looks 1,000,000 years old, it looks 1,000,000,000 years old, but signs of aging. For example, when we see light coming from other stars, we're not just seeing the light. We're seeing the light as it has been diffused, as it passes through interstellar dust. Well, what's God doing here? Is he making the star and the beam of light and making it look like the light has been passing through dust for billions of years when it hasn't been? That's absurd. So I would just say that the appearance of age analogy with Adam is not really relevant to the physical evidence for the age of the universe.
Another student of the class asked a question regarding relativity theory and how that could factor into our understanding of the creation account. Here's how Rob replied.
Well, the short answer to your question is yes, those things are taken into consideration. Not only are those things taken into consideration, but the evidence for relativity theory for things such as the fact that light does bend a bit as it passes by heavy objects has been confirmed to the nth degree in astronomical observations and astronomical science, astrophysics. And so you've got abundant evidence that that sort of thing is real and that those are genuine phenomena. And they're measurable. And so scientists clearly are able to take those things into account as they're looking at these physical objects. Now, I would just say to you that even a little bit of common sense, which it's difficult to, I shouldn't say that because it's difficult to grasp these things because of the sheer magnitude of the numbers and the sizes that we're talking about. But let's say the universe was really only several thousand years old. 10,000. We'll make it 10,000 just for a nice round number. And there are these gazillions of stars in it, and none of them are further away than 10,000 light years. They may seem like they are because of some kind of relativity quirk or whatever it is that you want to speculate might be the cause of this. But if there were that many stars and that many galaxies in that small of an area, we wouldn't be here very long because the stars would be running into each other every other day. And, we would have, every time there was a supernova, the entire universe would be blanketed by the radiation, and it would just be a disaster. So, in other words, the idea of trying to shrink down the entire universe to a size that would be roughly the equivalent of 1/10 of our galaxy, that's what you would have to do in order to make this hypothesis, this approach to solving the problem work. Now, I'll say one other thing, and that is that there are various scientific parameters here that all have to be explained that happen to bring together a coherent picture of the origins and history of the cosmos. It isn't just starlight, it's radiometric data, it's geological data, it's the knowledge that we've been able to gain with regards to the life cycles of stars, their life histories from the birth of stars to the death of stars, and the length of time it takes for them to pass through those things. So there's evidence that's terrestrial or geological in nature. There's evidence that's extraterrestrial, that's astronomical in nature. There's different kinds of astronomical data. There's different kinds of geological data. And all of this data from all these different scientific disciplines that are relatively independent of one another, not absolutely, because nothing is, but relatively independent of one another, brings a converging stream of evidences that the universe is much more than 10,000 years old. So, yes, you could try to come up with some kind of ad hoc explanation of this particular evidence or that particular evidence, but at some point, I think you have to throw your hands up and say, it really does seem to be the case that the universe is a lot older than 10,000 years. Now, we've kind of gotten off into the scientific questions here. I really wanted to focus on the Genesis passage, Genesis 1, and some of the exegetical issues there. But, the floor is open, so we'll just take whatever comes.
Sean asked a question regarding the timing of Satan and the other angels falling in relation to creation. Here's how Rob replied.
When did Satan and the demons fall? I don't know. The Bible does not say. I think we can infer from Genesis 3:1 that Satan had fallen prior to his tempting Eve. That's about as much as I could say. We really don't know. And so I think speculations or theories of origins that depend on being more precise as to when Satan fell are a little bit hazardous because we're trying to come up with information that we really don't have. We also don't know what precipitated Satan's rebellion. There are various speculations about this, one of which is that Satan was jealous of human beings. The Bible doesn't say that. That's a nice guess, but we really don't know.
Sean further questioned as to whether or not this poses a problem for the literal six-day creation view. Here's how Rob replied.
Not necessarily, since we don't know when exactly it happened. I'm sure there isn't any problem in correlating a belief in the fall of Satan and his demonic cohorts with a six-day creation. Nor do I see a problem making that cohere with other views. So I think it's a non-issue. The only place it really comes up is if you're going to hold to the traditional gap theory, you need to have Satan falling before God makes human beings. In fact, you need to have them falling long before God creates human beings. That's the only place where the issue really even comes up with regard to origins.
Sampson asked a question of great theological significance regarding the hotly debated topic of whether or not Adam and Eve had belly buttons. Here's how Rob responded.
No, I see no reason to think that Adam and Eve had belly buttons, but obviously the Bible doesn't address that particular question. A belly button presupposes that you were removed from the womb with an umbilical cord attached to you, and since Adam and Eve did not have that experience, there's no reason to think that they would have had belly buttons.
Bertrand, a student of the class, asked Rob to explain the assigned reading by Klein regarding the creation of heaven and earth being typology. Here's how Rob replied.
Okay, well, Meredith Klein, and that's K-L-I-N-E, for those who are trying to figure out who that is. Meredith Klein is the scholar I mentioned earlier who holds to the framework view. And the framework view is this idea, which I didn't really describe, but it's in the notes. If you're in the course, you got the syllabus notes about it. It's the view that Genesis 1 is really arranged more thematically or topically than chronologically, and that the first 3 days of creation correspond to the second 3 days in some kind of a literary way, so that the first day God creates the environments for the heavenly bodies in the daylight and in the nighttime. On the fourth day, he actually creates the occupants of the day and night, the sun for the day and the moon and stars for the night. On the second day, God creates or brings about the separation of the waters into the oceans and the atmosphere, the sky. And on the fifth day, he introduces the sea creatures, the fish and other animals that live in the sea, and the birds that live and occupy or have their domain as being in the sky. And then on the third day, God creates the domains, the domain of the physical, the land, the dry land, and puts vegetation on it. And then on the sixth day, God creates the creatures that inhabit and dominate that land. That would be, land animals and man. And so on this view, the 6 days of creation are not consecutive chronologically ordered days, but it's more of a literary, thematic, or topical arrangement designed to present the creation of human beings as the climax of God's creative work, and the whole thing is understood really as a kind of symbolic narrative explaining the significance of creation, the significance of man in the grand scheme of things. And that's basically what Klein is trying to do. Now, there's a lot more that could be said about it. I think you'd have to read it with that basic explanation in mind as to what he's trying to do. But he's not an easy read, so I probably should not have put him down as somebody that you needed to read. he's not an easy read, but he's provocative and introduces this idea of the framework view, which is catching on with a lot of people and has a lot going for it as one of the major alternative explanations of Genesis 1 to the young earth creationist view.
Someone asked a question regarding Australian Aborigines and their origins going back further than what a young earth creationist view would hold to. Here's how Rob replied.
Well, this question about Australian Aborigines or other people who seem to have been around a lot longer than 6,000 years is really a question for us to talk about next week. Maybe this is a good segue into next week's discussion, because there is this controversy over how long human beings have been on the earth. Now, this is an important question, even if you're a young earth creationist, because there is some difficulty even some young Earth creationists recognize a difficulty in keeping human history to only 6,000 years. And one of the questions that comes up here, see, the basis, and we'll talk about this next week, but the basis for thinking that man has only been on the earth for 6,000 years old is taking the genealogies, the genealogical records in Genesis chapters 5 and 11, adding up the number of years that each patriarch in those genealogies is said to have lived, and basically adding them up, and you get about 2,000 years between Adam and Abraham. And since Abraham lived about 4,000 years ago, that would mean that Adam lived about 6,000 years ago, or roughly 4,000 BC. And so if that's the case, then all of human history has to be fit within a 6,000-year period. Well, there are young Earth creationists who don't think that's possible, who agree that human beings have been on the earth longer than that. I mean, the city of Jericho appears to go back 8,000 years. So what do you do with that? All right, so there are young Earth creationists who have said, well, we can stretch the genealogies with some gaps to allow for some expansion of human history back maybe 8 or 10,000 years, but that's as far as they're going to go. There are other creationists, old Earth creationists, who are comfortable with the idea that human beings have been on the earth for 50,000 years, and there are various answers in between that. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about what Genesis has to say about that. We'll talk about the genealogies and try to at least look at some of the biblical information about that, as well as questions pertaining to the death of human beings, the death of animals. Does Genesis teach that death entered the animal world because of man's sin? That's another element of Genesis 1 we haven't gotten into yet because of time. So we're going to study Genesis more. We'll address some of these other questions as we go along. But if there's another question I need to get to this evening, we can do that. So let me get off the mic and we'll see if we've got any more questions.
Tom, a student of the class, asked a question regarding why one who would accept a literal translation of God creating Adam from the dust of the ground to a fully formed human, but reject a literal 6-day understanding of the creation account itself. Here's how Rob responded.
Well, Tom, I'm going to put that question off for next week because a 30-second or even a 60-second answer would not do it justice. I would say that the term literal here, as I tried to caution earlier, is a little bit of a slippery term. You know, I'm reading Genesis 1 as historical in its content, as a narrative that's giving us factual information about what God did in the past. There's only so much you can do with the text in terms of not taking something literally and still remain within that general understanding. So the fact that I am suggesting that the days of Genesis 1 need not be 6 literal consecutive 24-hour days does not mean that I have thrown open the door wide open to any kind of symbolic, non-literal, non-historical, non-factual interpretation of Genesis. Not at all. I'm simply saying that there are some elements of the text that young Earthers take literally and some that they don't, and there's some elements that old Earth creationists take literally and some that they don't. And so we've got to look at everything and try to put it together as best we can and not take the simplistic idea that it's either all or nothing, either it's all literal or none of it's literal. Those are unacceptable extremes, in my opinion.
A student asked a question regarding the passage in 2 Peter 3 and wondered whether or not that gave us any insight into the actual translation of the word day found in Genesis. Here's how Rob replied.
Well, in terms of actually illuminating what Genesis 1 is intended to say, no, I don't think 2 Peter 3 is giving us any information that would settle any of these questions. The expression "the day of the Lord" simply is too general an expression to use that to say, see, it's a 24-hour period, because we have no description of the day of the Lord that would indicate that it all takes place within a 24-hour period. In fact, depending on your eschatology, some people would say it certainly doesn't happen within a 24-hour period. Others would say it could. There's no way to settle that without getting into all the eschatological controversies, and we're only going to do one big controversial area at a time. The other thing I would say is, as far as a day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years is as a day, that really doesn't have too much relevance. I know old earth creationists and some friends of mine that would bring that verse up, at least to show that it's possible that a day in Genesis 1 might be a long period of time. Yeah, it could be, but that verse doesn't show that it is. It only shows that it's making an analogy. It's really not trying to, some people have read 2 Peter 3, I think it's verse 8, as a code for when you see the word day in the Bible, it's really 1,000 years. No, that's not the case. And so we need to be careful about not overreaching from 2 Peter 3. But at the same time, it shows that words can be used in different contexts with different senses and different intentions, and that's true with Genesis 1, but 2 Peter 3 isn't going to settle the question at all. I want to close here by just saying that I presented the issues as best we could in the time that we had, and I've introduced some of my own opinions and my own discoveries and my own thoughts about it. Evangelical Christians have different points of view on this. I'm not trying to push this as the only acceptable Christian view. I'm not even speaking officially for the theology program as this is the position that the theology program takes. I'm not doing that. I'm sure Michael Patton will be relieved to hear me say that. I'm simply expressing a point of view, giving you my reasons for it, encouraging you to do your own reading, do your own studying, think through the issues for yourself, and come up with your own conclusions on it. If that means you end up disagreeing with me, that's fine. If it means you end up agreeing with me, well, you're a really smart person, but no, I'm just kidding. That's great, but that's not what this is about. It's about Christians learning enough about the issues to respect one another in our differences, and at the same time take seriously the challenge of trying to work through them as best we can, because these are important apologetic issues. If you're a young earth creationist, you're convinced that anybody who teaches an old earth is compromising the biblical teaching. If you're an old earth creationist, you're convinced that young earth creationism is hampering our efforts to make Christianity credible to people by giving them, and we're not trying to make it, but like change it, but to explain it in a way that's credible and consistent with the scientific facts. So the issues are great on both sides. Depending on whichever view you hold, you think this is an important issue for different reasons. But at the same time, we ought to be able to respect the fact that we're all Christians, evangelical Christians who are arguing about these things. And this is not something that, if you hold to the wrong view, you're not saved or something. But it is an issue that needs to be addressed because it's one that we cannot duck, we cannot avoid when we're doing Christian apologetics. All right, I better stop with that. I look forward to talking with you all again next week. We'll continue our study of Genesis. We're in a three-part, sort of a three-section series here. We did 3 introductory class sessions. Now we're doing 3 on the Bible, looking what the Bible says, focusing primarily on that. And then the last 3, we're going to go into the science in some depth, talk about scientific arguments for and against evolution and other issues pertaining to science. So hope that you'll come back for all that. Look forward to it.